9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello and welcome to Deep State Radio. This is Rosa Brooks. I'm standing in temporarily for David Rothkopf, our fearless leader, who should be joining us shortly. But we're going to talk today about election interference and disinformation, and we have a terrific guest today. We're joined by Renee DiResta. She's a writer and researcher who studies how adversaries exploit digital platforms to manipulate, harass, and target individuals and societies. Renee, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, look, there's David Rothkopf. David, you want to redo that?
No, I like the intro, Rosa. It was much better, and I'm sure people are much more interested. Now I've slipped into their DMs. You know what I mean?
Okay, all right. Well, David, we're happy to have you join us, and if you want to re-record that intro later, go for it. I was just going to ask Renee a really softball question, but I'm going to let you take over.
Go ahead with the softball question.
All right. Renee.
I'll follow up with a real hardball question.
Okay, Renee. So we have an election coming up. I don't know if anyone in our listeners have noticed that we have an election coming up. It's a pretty big one, and I have heard rumors that various actors, domestic and foreign, might have a stake in the outcome of the election and might just be up to some dirty tricks, trying to manipulate U.S. voters or manipulate the election in some way. Is this true? And when you think about this, what worries you most? What are the things that are the rumors? Don't give them too much credence, and what are the things that we actually should be worried about?
And if this isn't true, why do you still have a job?
It's a great question. I don't know if I have a job. No, I left Stanford in June, but I do still work, it turns out. So there's a couple things. First, the election. For the last 3 American presidential elections, we have seen state actor interference, right? So in 2016, Russia was probably the most notorious. 2020, we had Russia, Iran, both doing things. 2022 in the midterms, we had Russia, Iran, and China. One of the things that's happened is that as social media has made it very, very easy to reach foreign publics, what you've seen is that state actors who have always kind of played a role in attempting to participate in the American media ecosystem to nudge readers and viewers and the public into directions that are advantageous to them, now just use social media to do that as well. So we have seen propaganda campaigns in the Cold War. We've seen them even prior to that. We have seen state actors, again, just committed adversarial actors who just want to shape public opinion where they can. They do this through a combination of broadcast and now social media. They do it along the overt to covert spectrum. Overt would be, for example, RT or Sputnik in Russia's case. Covert would be the sort of fake accounts that they create, or the front media operations, fake news outlets and things like that they kind of create and then pretend belong to real members of the American public. So there's again that sort of broadcast and social over to covert spectrum. You have a ton of different types of tactics that makes possible. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that even as we talk about what they do and how they're doing it, they are not the most impactful voices in the room. And American influencers, American media, the real American public, the candidates, their surrogates, those are the people who really have voices that carry weight. When they speak, people are automatically paying attention. They have very large audiences. And just because you see a communication doesn't mean that you are swayed by it, doesn't mean that you even really pay attention to it. So this question of what is the impact that foreign state actors have is one where I think it's important to recognize that you must act against them so that they don't grow large audiences and become impactful. So it's sort of a constant adversarial churn. But at the same time, it is really the domestic speakers in the American political conversation that actually are having the impact and shaping public opinion.
Okay, well, let me follow that up because Rose has teed this up perfectly with the real question that's on everybody's mind. And that is, are the Russians behind the Haitians eating cats and dogs?
And do Russians eat cats?
And I say that kind of tongue in cheek. If you know they are, by the way, please. and dogs, right? But I actually know a story of a former American national security advisor going for a high-level meeting in Russia and them serving him moose lips, which sounds to me just as bad, but it's off the point. My point is this: even if they're not, doesn't the some of this foreign interference involve amplification of some of those domestic people, the influencers you're talking about, and doesn't the sort of degradation of the information space by a proliferation of misinformation purveyors um, end up opening the door and normalizing this sort of thing so that it becomes very difficult to trust anything, which I believe in the first instance is the objective of disinformation campaigns, no?
Of Russian disinformation campaigns, yes. That question of, I think Peter Pomerantsev put it well in his book title a few years back. Nothing is true and everything is possible, right? How can you possibly know the truth? There has not been that I've seen any evidence linking an actual set of Russian accounts to the story of the sort of cat eating in Springfield, Ohio. That seems to have originated with a post made in a Facebook group and by an account that appears to have been real. And then it's what we call a rumor, right? I think misinformation and disinformation are terms that get tossed around a bit. Rumor is a term that we've always had that's existed long prior to, even mass media, even any kind of mass communication, because it's person to person spreading of something that sounds salacious and interesting. And one of the things that is very common in the election is that you see rumors traveling. Oh, I heard that this happened. Oh, my friend said that her friend said that this other thing happened. And so a lot of the original stories about the situation with cats was a combination of people who were spreading it because it sounded plausible. And then the narrative has political power. So you see incentivized people pick it up. There were some links to white supremacist organizations that had used it in sort of city commentary. There was some video that was found of that happening. Again, the question of where it originates sometimes is complicated, but it makes its way onto social media where anyone can amplify it. And are there fake accounts boosting it? Yes, absolutely, no doubt, because there are almost always at this point fake accounts boosting highly salacious political rumors. This is something that we've seen happen again as Russia used to try to create accounts that would serve as the communicators themselves. They had a very high profile account pretending to be a Black woman, right, who spoke a lot and was actually retweeted by quite famous people like Jack Dorsey and political figures, right? So they used to make their own kind of fake people and speak as them. But as that became more and more complicated to do, they moved instead to models of things like amplification or trying to boost the conversation where it is. The most impactful voices in the sort of Springfield cat eating conversation was the were people like the vice presidential candidate himself, JD Vance. And then one thing that was very interesting is that this was sort of like an extremely online conversation that hopped to mainstream attention when Trump referenced it during the debate. And what you see is the Google search, you can track Google search trends. All of a sudden, all of these people are searching for eating the cats, and trying to figure out what this man is saying, what he has just said in a national debate that in Springfield, they're eating the cats. And so you see the public that is not extremely online, that is not sitting there in this weird echo chamber, looking to try to figure out what the hell he is actually talking about. And one of the things that this reflects is that we're living in what I call sort of almost segmented realities at this point, right? Where if you're in right-wing Twitter, eating the cats is the, that's the thing that's occupied you for 48 hours. Whereas if you're a normal person who is not spending all of your time in that cesspool, then eating the cats is something that you have to go and Google to figure out what the hell is this person talking about. And one thing that Russia is very, very good at, just to reconnect it back to the state actor thing, and China and Iran for that matter, are finding the niches, right? Finding the exploitable niches, recognizing that the discourse has degraded to this, and then saying, okay, well, we're going to go and we're going to boost that thing because this is a thing that is really riling up the Americans. This is great for us. It others some people creates tension, creates discord, and we can really lean into that. So yes, I have no doubt that those accounts are amplifying it. But again, the ones that matter, the voice shaping that conversation was JD Vance and Donald Trump.
Rosa, how does Rosa Brooks's dog Scout feel about this?
My dog Scout is truly offended at the idea that hardworking pets such as herself are being misused as for this propaganda purpose. She's outraged. Um, but I think that's a really interesting point, Renee, which is that I take you to be saying it's not that we shouldn't worry about deliberate election interference and misinformation by foreign actors. Of course, we should worry about it, but that there is so much noise in an election like this, including so much just plain idiocy and lies, rumors, gullibility, stupidity coming from our own side, from homegrown American accounts, that we should not we should remember that not every piece of stupidity or lie comes from the Russians or comes from the North Koreans or the Iranians, that sometimes it's just us being stupid, and we've always been kind of stupid, and we should, not, I mean, and I actually think that's kind of an important point, right? Because there's a little bit of a tendency maybe to assume that if only we could get rid of these malign foreign actors, or this sort of deliberate disinformation campaigns being sown for sort of by high-powered actors for political purposes, that we would return to some state of electoral purity in this country. And we've never really had that. We never really will have that. Which doesn't mean it's okay. I mean, I also hear you saying, you can't just ignore this stuff, because they are trying to interfere. And if we aren't sort of eternally vigilant, that being the price of liberty, it will get worse. It will get more effective. But what do you see, recognizing that sometimes we see stupid stuff that is seeded by foreign actors, and we see it, but that doesn't mean it has an influence. If you think about the disinformation campaigns, foreign or domestic, that have had an impact that you do see as most dangerous, either current or in the last, 8 or 10 years, are there any that strike you as, here's an example of one that really was pretty scary and pretty effective?
There have been a few that have gotten some significant attention. I remember and actually, interestingly, I'll give you an example from 2020, because I don't know that people paid as much attention to it. In 2020, the actors that were doing interesting things were mostly Iran. Russia was there, largely kind of around the edges. You remember they lost all of their assets after their accounts came down in 2018. So all these persona accounts that had managed to amass 500,000 followers were nuked, right? They then were scrambling, kind of reorienting their strategy. But Iran did this interesting thing where they began emailing voters pretending to be the Proud Boys. They were emailing voters, I think mostly down in Florida, if I'm not mistaken. I was down south, and they were emailing them saying, like, you've got to change, we have all of your information. We have your voter registration. We know where you live. You need to change your vote, and you need to vote for Trump. And they were sort of spoofing an email address, pretending to be the Proud Boys. And then they were simultaneously releasing these videos pretending that they had hacked voting machines as well. They had, I think, an old voter file, and they were, sorry, not voting machines, that they had hacked voter records. And so they had these this sort of footage of, they were sort of showing a scroll through some of these things, and through some like records. It was like making people very nervous. The FBI got involved, CISA got involved. We did a bunch of investigation into that to try to help with that. So we had this weird campaign whereby they were trying to make Trump look bad by creating these harassing emails. It became a national news story. The people who got them, some of them were actually pretty rattled. We heard from a few as this was happening, because you remember there was some significant concern on the left that there would be violence at the polling places on election day. And this was, again, some of it was kind of vague rumors that were not really substantiated, not really rooted in reality. But you would go on TikTok and you would see kids, even 20-year-olds, making these videos about, like, queer people shouldn't go to the polling places, Black people shouldn't go to the polling places because they're going to get beaten up. Yeah. So the way in which this kind of strange dynamic by which this comes about was interesting. And then after the election, so that this operation happens, it's attributed to Iran. after the election, as the sort of political tensions begin to rise, this website appears called Enemies of the People, and it is a docs website, and it posts the names and addresses of people that the right has begun to accuse of stealing the election. And so you have all of a sudden a docs website called Enemies of the People encouraging the targeting of these election officials by posting their pictures, their addresses, and this information. And that was another one where I was also linked to Iran after the fact, where that sort of that willingness to incite violence, that willingness to lean into that tension to the degree where they're trying to get, trying to raise the temperature, trying to make these docs lists. And then also there's the question of like, are they trying to make Trump voters look bad? One of the things we do see from Iran is when they're putting out positive messaging, it's usually to help candidates sort of on the what you might call the sort of squad wing of the Democrat Party, the more progressive candidates. They're actually reaching all the way down ballot, trying to boost candidates that they see as having a position that aligns with theirs on Israel, Palestine, and on Iran sanctions and other issues. And so you do see them operating in this space in a pretty interesting way. But the Enemies of the People website was also actually was also actually quite creepy.
So let me follow up with a question about the recent action by the Department of Justice targeting a Russian effort in this area that talked about money being funneled to a U.S. company that had influencers involved. The company also did amplification of people like Tucker Carlson. For months in Washington, I've been hearing there is a lot of information about Russian money traveling to U.S. influencers. Yeah. Will the Department of Justice act on it? And when this story broke, it was like, oh, well, they're actually going to do it before the election. But there was also a lot of buzz to the effect that there are a lot of other shoes that could drop on this, that this is much bigger. What's your take on all that?
I think it is much bigger. I think you have to see this in the context of so what we've been describing, right? The eternal vigilance piece means that their capacity to act on social media has been very, very limited by social media companies constantly acting against them, right? Facebook has a persistent integrity team. It doesn't just get turned on and off. It's been in continuous operation, and they're constantly taking down Russian networks. So what this means is that if you think about that sort of like covert social, quadrant, if you will, of tactics and activities, they're losing their ability to establish a foothold there because while Twitter has really backed off, doesn't really seem to be doing this very much anymore, other platforms still are. And so if you still want to have reach and voice in that conversation on social media, one of the things you can do is you can simply pay people, right? And Russia is not the first that we've seen do this. We have seen China pay influencers to make videos in the past as well. What China does most of the time is China cares a lot about shaping public perception of China. Russia cares about kind of creating social discord and moving people into these very factionalized kind of political mindsets and discourse, really leans into the culture war and has since 2016. China, when they're paying them, it's like, say nice things about the Olympics, say that we're not doing bad things to the Uyghurs, so it's much more like, let's get some propaganda out there making China sound good, but they're paying them also, right? And that's because influencers have reach and voice. They have trusted audiences. They're seen as authentic. And again, you can kind of pay people to create content that they would actually be willing to create on their own. You just kind of nudge them a little bit further, right? And that's just what you see in the DOJ indictment. It's not that, none of these influencers that they're paying, the kind of old classical term is useful idiots, right? People who didn't even know where the money was coming from. They didn't bother to actually check. It seems like they were willing to assume that some man was just paying them $100,000 per video, which is extraordinary. But when they were making these videos, they were not shifting their political positions. They were willing to compromise journalistic ethics and values for a paycheck to put out things that were just a little bit further than they might have otherwise done on their own. So for example, in the indictment, you read that they want, they are asked to produce a video alleging that or just asking questions about the fact that Ukraine might have been behind that ISIS initiated massacre in Moscow. And again, this was after the massacre had already been attributed to ISIS, but they were still willing to put out a video saying, I don't know, some people are saying that ISIS, yeah, we're talking about ISIS, maybe Ukraine was involved, right? And so you see them, they've had a very strong position opposed to Ukraine in this war for some time. So they're not being asked to take a different stance. They're being asked to move their audience a little bit more, a little sort of like further down the rabbit hole, if you will.
Before I go to Rosa for the question, it strikes me listening to you that one of the most potent tools that the misinformation and disinformation purveyors have are little phrases like those regularly used by Trump. One is a lot of people are saying, and
Big if true.
and the other is, as he said with the dogs and cats, well, I saw it on television or I saw it on the internet. And if those things carry a lot of pernicious weight, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think this is actually where, give you like a kind of a lesson from history here. One of the things you saw in the 1930s, right, as fascist propaganda was making its way into the United States through even domestic voices like Father Coughlin, the sort of radio priest who had about 30 million listeners at his peak. One of the things that you see is that playing whack-a-mole with specific rumors or factual claims or this story, that story, today it's eating cats, tomorrow who knows what it is going to be, it's actually making people see the rhetoric as the red flag, right? What is the rhetoric of propaganda that people should be attuned to? When you hear somebody say, well, I saw it on television, that's a screaming red flag. That has to be the thing that people begin to recognize. That's the only source you have. That's the best information you've got. That's the fact you're using. Or things like big if true, or someone should look into this, or a lot of people are saying, right, where these are hallmarks of there's a great meme that you may have seen, like a man in blue, and it says source and then I made it up, right? And I think about that meme every time I hear those words, and I want people to like have that association, because that's literally what's happening. You're literally saying, what my cousin's friend's sister's uncle saw it on their television. That's a rumor. That's a screaming red flag that you should actually be going and trying to figure out, did anybody reputable come up with any actual incidents of this actually happening? And I think that's the kind of, that was how it was treated in the 1930s. Father Coughlin says these things. These are the rhetorical red flags you should be listening to. That was how the sort of educational effort went at that time. And I think a century later, we should be.
Yeah, I have another historical question, though, right? I mean, because you're mentioning Father Coughlin, fascism, and when you think about something like the rise of Hitler and the big lie theory of politics, right? That so there's nothing new here about the ability of malign political actors to just plain make shit up, right? In
Yes.
for destructive purposes, in ways that lead to millions upon millions believing absolute falsehoods, which then, obviously in the case of fascism, in the case of Nazism, led to the deaths of millions upon millions of human beings. And this was in an era in which there was no internet. There were newspapers and there were radios. There was no television, there was no internet, etc. And yet we saw the most outrageous, barefaced, appalling lies deliberately be disseminated and spread like wildfire through multiple populations with devastating effect. So I guess my question is, this is partly a sort of, is there anything new under the sun? What, if anything, really is different, right? We all run around saying, and this is like the standard conference question in the last 5 to 10 years, is some variant of, yes, but what about misinformation, or what about AI manipulated information space, right? That's when you can't think of anything else to say, you throw that one out there and everybody kind of looks wise and strokes their chins and nods a little bit. And is this really what is new here that we need to worry about versus what is just the same old shit? And is there any comfort? I mean, you're suggesting that, okay, maybe there was some antidote to some of this propaganda, at least in the case of Father Coughlin, that perhaps there was a successful effort to get people to be more attuned to the fact that there are certain, trigger phrases that suggest that what you are about to hear is a load of crap, or what you've just heard is a load of crap. And, I would add the sort of QAnon, do your own research, to phrases that many of us have come to mistrust. But can we draw any solace from history, or is mostly the lesson of history that it doesn't matter what the technology is? Humans, we're a bunch of suckers, and we're easily manipulated, and for deadly ends.
Well, I think it is, a lot of it is an over focus on the technology problem by virtue of the fact, like, here's where it's disseminated, and ergo we focus a lot on social media, when it is in fact very much a human problem. It's just, that the capacity to propagandize has been democratized. I think that is very, very interesting and different. People play a very active role in information dissemination today in a way that they did not in the age of broadcast media, which means that, in my opinion, polarization is actually incredibly significant, because you do have people who, like, the engagement, like the normal way to engage on Twitter is to sit there trying to own your enemies, right? Is to participate in a very factionalized politics where you retweeting the story about people eating cats is a way to signify that you too are a member of this community, and that, you're participating in getting the word out there. So I think that, my gripe with the term disinformation I use in a very reserved way, right? Usually for what we're talking about with regard to deliberate manipulation campaigns, like what Russia did with Tenet Media and otherwise, where there is an intentional effort to deceive. There's a very systematic way to go about doing it. But I think words like propaganda and rumors have been largely absent from our conversations about this. And that's because misinformation frames it as a problem of facts. Well, if we just tell people, no, they're not eating the cats, then they'll stop believing it and the world will go back to normal. And that's not what's going to happen. There is such a proliferation of propaganda, and I think we need to get comfortable with that word again, and to see it not as some top-down mechanism of, like, the state telling you what to think, but rather people who have an agenda having the tools of, the tools to shape public opinion very directly. I think that's actually very, very distinctly different, because it also invests people in the propaganda, which, from the psychological standpoint, people like Jacques Ellul have been writing since the 1960s about the need to activate people, the purpose not being to persuade, but to activate. And so people are very much activated because this is what they do with their free time online. Not all of them. Again, as we said, people sit on their couch and have to go searching for what is the man talking about with the eating of the cats, right? But you do have these sort of very factionalized niche groups that are incredibly effective at getting messages out. The thing with AI, this is where it's not ready for, like, prime time on the manipulation front yet. I think we'll see more audio, more manipulative audio. That I think it's also important to note that it is very well entrenched in the spam and scam communities now, right? It hasn't necessarily made the hop to politics. Maybe that's a normalization thing. Maybe people are a little bit worried about what happens if they use it in that realm. But you are seeing an increasing prevalence of the ability to generate voices that sound like people, to make people take action. And I think one thing that I'm very interested in, the way that I would envision it being used in this election, would actually be creating collateral to support the rumor. Meaning, let's say a rumor about rigged voting machines goes viral again, right? As there will absolutely be a rigged voting machine rumor that will go viral in this election. Like, I would bet a lot of money on that. But this time you can create collateral that goes along with that. You can make a picture. You can have audio of two supposed poll workers talking about how they're doing the rigging. And you can say, we got this off of a security camera. Listen to what these people are saying. And because of that factionalized politics, a large percentage of people will believe it. And even if a fact check comes out, or media says, no, this isn't real, or an authenticator says, no, this isn't real, if the people don't trust the source of the authentication, that's the other piece of what's happening here. We're thinking about it as a crisis of content. What it is a crisis of trust, and the content is used to exacerbate that crisis of trust. And that, I think, is the novel and kind of precarious way in which the technological problem and the social problem intersect.
I think it's a great point. And as we're getting here towards the end of our time, the flip side of trust is skepticism. And Rosa and I are dyed in the wool skeptics. In fact, my whole philosophy of life is something in excess of half of all the things we know to be true aren't true. And in fact, when Rosa talks about going back in history, um, there are a lot of things that people build their whole lives around that aren't true, that are made up. And we accept them because we
Oh,
want to
come on,
believe
David.
them.
Next thing you're going to tell me that the Earth is round.
Well, I wouldn't. We've had that conversation before, Rosa, and I know I'm not going to win it with you, which is why you moved to Montana, where everybody agrees with you. But having said that, um, we still have to live in this world. And what I've found is when I look at social media now, it used to be if I saw a social media post by somebody that I trusted and I thought it was worth sharing, I would share it. I don't
Right.
do that anymore because I've seen too many people that I trusted who have been suckered by bad information. So
Yeah.
almost inevitably, what I will do is I will go to the underlying piece and say, what's the source for that? Because there's just too much junk. There's too much noise out there in the system. Um, do you have advice for the consumer of information in an election year that doesn't take more than, I don't know, a minute or two to phrase?
Well, I mean, I think before you share is what you're getting at, and one of the things that I've said over the years too, and I'm right there with you. I mean, I tell the story in my book of like this moment, Covington Catholic, right, where the young man with a MAGA hat and a Native American elder, this image that went viral after they have sort of a small confrontation on the mall, National Mall in Washington D.C. And I remember waking up. I was in San Francisco that day, and all of these people are sharing this image and I asked somebody like, what are we all mad about this morning? Like, what is happening here? Um, and and I refrained from commenting because I've seen too many of these things happen where the truth then comes out 2 hours later, and it's just a bad look, right? The rush to judgment, the assumptions that we make, the assumption that our side is always correct, whatever our side happens to be. And I think that extra discernment really is the critical life skill for this moment. That yes, it might feel good to be part of a sort of factional mob sharing the outrage content of the day, but if it outrages you, that is actually the time when you need to go and do that extra degree of Googling or trying to see, are other people talking about this? Where is the source? Where is the story coming from? So it is the sort of think before you share, and to recognize if the things that make you most upset are actually probably the things that you shouldn't be sharing until you go and confirm that they're real.
It's interesting.
That is
I look at
extremely good.
sorry, I was just going to say, I look at
Go on.
my children's generation, and I almost worry in some ways about the opposite problem for them, right? This is a generation that all through their even elementary school, they were hearing in school things like, let's think about how you get manipulated by advertisers, by the media. They don't trust anything, right? That no matter what you tell them, they're like, yeah, well, people are trying to manipulate me, and that seems like almost an opposite problem, that we need to get people to be alert to the ways in which they're being manipulated. But how do you carve out some space for actual truth, and how do you against this backdrop where people are rightly cynical and rightly suspect that
Mhm.
everybody from advertisers trying to make a profit to foreign powers trying to sway a US election is trying hard to tell them stuff that isn't true and make them believe it. How do you carve out any sphere for what's real?
People are starting to look at that on TikTok now. There was an article, I think maybe in the Washington Post yesterday. Claire Wardle was cited in that. She's done a lot of work on media literacy over the years. And there is a sense that, people on TikTok, right, they there's almost like a suspended disbelief. It's almost like it's all just entertainment. And if you need to go figure out if something is real, you're going to leave social media and then go try to figure that out elsewhere. Dana Boyd wrote about this in 2018. I think she has this great talk. So you think you want media literacy? Do you? It's up on her Medium. You can
Mhm.
kind of read it. And there too, she makes exactly this point, right? Which is how do you teach critical thinking without creating such a degree of of paranoia, right? Where you can say like, oh, I should just throw up my hands because it's impossible to know the facts and the truth. One initiative that Twitter had that is very, very good is this thing that it used to call Birdwatch and now calls community notes, where you did have the capacity for the community to come and try to annotate, right? Where the fact check wasn't necessarily coming through the media, which might not have been trusted by some percentage of the audience that saw it, but rather a different segments of the community had to roughly agree in order for the what's called the bridging algorithm to sort of surface the community written fact check. But community notes is an interesting way to try to pull together that wisdom of crowds. Where it falls down is in breaking news situations where the people who are sitting on their couches at home cannot write a community note. They're not there. They don't know. But it is the sort of thing where in aggregate, it does provide a way to say like, hey, here's the, when the content is not about something that is breaking, when the content is about maybe a decontextualized fact or an erroneously recounted history, you do have that capacity to kind of like make the crowd participate in that opinion shaping in a more constructive way than just being kind of rote amplifiers. And so I think it gives people agency. I think it is actually a really fantastic feature. And I would like to see more platforms actually kind of adopt that model.
Yeah, until it is corrupted or co-opted by the owner of the platform. So I mean, even there, I think we're entering. One of my conclusions here is that we're entering a new golden age for skepticism, and I'm all for it. I think it's extremely useful. I want to thank you for the conversation. To the audience, I met Renee at an event that Rosa set up, and it was the day before Renee's book came out. Invisible Rulers, the people who turn lies into reality. And if you haven't read the book, you should go read the book because it will give you more of the kind of insight we've got here. For now, thank you very much, Renee. We'll have you back again soon. Thank you, Rosa, wherever you are on this flat earth. And we'll all be back with more podcasts. We've got another one coming later today on what you can trust in the data about the election. And can you trust a poll, or is there something else you should be looking for? So a lot of what can you trust today. So join us for that. And thank you everybody for joining us for this. Until then, bye-bye.